Hey, how's it going, and welcome to another video. I hope you're having a good Fire Emblem November. So I figured it'd be kind of fun to take a step back into the past and reminisce on my memories of Fire Emblem before I played Fire Emblem. Since it is a series that does have a pretty interesting history over here, and I'm sure it's something a lot of people can relate to. This is the kind of thing that, I'm sure many of us have experienced, so it can be kind of fun to reminisce on the past and, how we felt way back in the day. So, like the vast majority of people in the West, my first experience with just Fire Emblem as a thing was through Smash Bros. Melee. Like many of us boomers, Melee really was one of the defining games of my childhood. I remember just spending hours and hours and hours playing it. And one of my favorite characters, probably my favorite character to play as in my youth, was Roy. But that of course came with the irony that I really didn't know who Roy was. Of all the series that were represented in Melee, Fire Emblem really was the odd one out. Since that was the only series represented that we never got any of their games. And there was always such a mystique to Marth and Roy, because, they really did feel like they were these characters from some secret other dimension. They both spoke Japanese, none of their games were in the West. They really were the characters that, nobody here really knew anything about who these people were. Everybody knows all the Mario characters, all the Zelda characters, all the Pokemans, and even the series that are a little bit more obscure, F-Zero, I guess, Earthbound. Their games were at least over here. Marth and Roy never had the same luxury. And of course, emulators and stuff existed, but the fan translation scene back then was not, anything it was in, that mid-2000s, early 2010s kind of golden age of, here is an old game that has never been brought over, to English-speaking countries. Let's, translate it. And that's another thing, is that, the internet back then was not the same thing that it is today. Now, assuming you did have a computer in your house and an internet connection, it's not like YouTube existed. Right now, if I wanted to, I can go on YouTube and find a playthrough of the fucking Satellaview Fire Emblem game. Just the most obscure shit, anything you can find. Back in the day, we all believed in Dragon Ball AF and that Goku was a Super Saiyan 5. So if you wanted to learn about, what is Fire Emblem, there really wasn't a great place to do it. I'm sure there were a lot of fan sites and stuff back in the day. But there wasn't any centralized location for that sort of stuff. There wasn't a YouTube, there weren't really wikis. And I feel as if even Melee itself never did a great job of kind of expressing what Fire Emblem was, if that makes sense. You can pretty obviously infer, okay, they're both, swordsmen, it's probably some sort of medieval setting, but what else? There wasn't any stage, there was one song, and even looking at the 6 trophies, that's another thing, is that the trophies that represented Fire Emblem in that game were only for Marth and Roy, and they really don't tell you hardly anything. Here's Roy's trophy, for example, from Melee. The son of the Lord of the Faerie Principality, Roy was studying in Ostia when the Kingdom of Bern invaded the League of Lycia. His father fell ill at this time, so Roy assumed leadership of Faere's armies. After his fateful meeting with the Princess Guinevere, his destiny became inextricably linked with the fate of the entire continent. And then his other 2 trophies, the ones you would get for clearing Adventure Mode and All-Star Mode, only tell you gameplay stuff. One of Roy's is, while Roy's moves are well balanced, he's a little on the slow side and doesn't excel at mid-air combat. His blade, the Sword of Seals, gives him excellent reach, and makes his double-edged dance slightly different than Marth's dancing blade. When it's fully charged, Roy's destructive Flare Blade delivers an instant KO. So it really doesn't tell you anything about, the history of Fire Emblem, what the games are actually like. And when you compare that to, I'll just use Mr. Game & Watch's trophy as an example. First appearing in 1980, the Game & Watch series is the father of all portable liquid crystal games. The main character is simple and monochrome, but has a timeless individuality. There are 39 different games in the series, and they've sold over 43 million units worldwide. And so from that, when I was a kid, I didn't know what the hell a Game & Watch was. But after playing Melee and, looking through these trophies and stuff, I kinda understood it, These were individual handheld units that were sold way back in the day, and they were really simple, and Mr. Game & Watch was the guy that was, like, in those games. But when you read Roy and Marth's, like, trophies, you really didn't feel like you were any closer to understanding, like, Fire Emblem as a thing, I guess. Like, Marth's trophy is kind of just a lore dump about what happens in his games. But it didn't shed a lot of light on, like, okay, but what is Fire Emblem? And that's kind of just how things were for, like, at least 2 years until Blazing Sword came out. Like, to us, Fire Emblem was just this mysterious thing that exists in Japan, but it's like, it's hard to figure out what it actually is. And if you want to learn more about it, like, find some obscure fan site, or, like, go fuck yourself, I guess. Or speak Japanese, that was also an option for little 6 and 7-year-old me. But eventually we did start getting these games, and I never bought any of them. When I was a kid, I distinctly remember going into Circuit City and seeing Pokemon Fire Red and then that Fire Emblem game that Marth and Roy are from. And I never took the plunge. I always preferred the safety of new Pokemon or just new, like, thing I was familiar with, rather than taking the dive into the Fire Emblem that I don't really know, like, what this thing is. And that's how things remained for a while. Like, Path of Radiance, I remember seeing at Toys R Us, never got it. Radiant Dawn came out, never got it. Then, of course, Brawl came out and had Ike as its, like, new Fire Emblem representation. But it wasn't until Awakening when I feel like, for whatever reason, Awakening really caused this sort of, like, Western cultural shift to, like, paying attention to Fire Emblem, I guess. Like, Awakening really was the first release of one of these games that I remember people being excited about on the internet at large. Because before that point, it was always a fairly niche series that definitely had its fans, but to the vast majority of people, Fire Emblem was the game series that Marth, Roy, and Ike were from. And then Awakening came out, and it ended up being, like, the best-selling Fire Emblem game at that point. And I think, like, a lot of what that had to do with was the fact that the 3DS, like, had no fucking games. So people were dying to just have something to play on that system. And Fire Emblem comes out, and it's this thing that people are familiar enough with, but, like, still have a curiosity about. And that was finally the time for, I guess, everybody to be like, okay, I guess I'll give that Fire Emblem thing a try. And that's exactly what I did. And I remember that bitch was sold out everywhere. Since Nintendo was obviously not expecting, like, a new Fire Emblem game to be one of their smash hits of the entire year. But yeah, eventually it finally happened. It took, like, a decade, I guess, of it kind of stirring around in people's subconscious. But eventually, like, me and many others were just like, alright, it's like, let's try Fire Emblem. But yeah, that's my little story. I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next time.